His phone lit up on the kitchen counter at 11 p.m. She doesn't suspect a thing. He was right, until he wasn't. Let me take you back to where this started. My name is Vivian Ashford. I'm 45 years old, co-founder and CEO of a boutique architecture firm in Providence, Rhode Island. I've spent 20 years reading buildings the way other people read faces, knowing instantly where the weight sits, where a structure is sound, and where it's quietly failing behind a fresh coat of paint. I never once thought I'd need that particular skill to read my own marriage. If this is your first time here, hit like, subscribe, and tell me your city in the comments. I read every one. I founded Ashford & Vance Architecture in 2005, fresh out of grad school, with nothing but a folding table and a rented studio on Federal Hill, and a stubborn belief that Providence's old mill buildings deserve better than the wrecking ball. My business mentor, Marcus Delane, a retired developer who'd made his fortune restoring the city's historic textile mills, believed in that stubbornness enough to put up the seed money. He never wanted control. He wanted, in his words, to watch someone build something honest in this city for once. I married Grant 2 years after founding the firm. He was a numbers man, sharp with spreadsheets, in a way I never was, and I brought him on as our chief financial officer within our first 5 years. It felt at the time like the most natural thing in the world, the woman who designed the buildings, and the man who made sure we could afford to build them. For a long time, it worked exactly the way it was supposed to. 20 years is a long time to build something with someone. It's also, I'd learned, a long time for someone to quietly start planning their exit from it. I want to be honest about how slowly this crept in, because that's the part people don't always believe. It wasn't a sudden collapse. It was small, almost forgivable things, stacking one on top of another until the weight of them became impossible to ignore. Grant started working later. Not dramatically later, just late enough that it never quite warranted a conversation on its own. He'd come home at 9, at 10, apologetic and tired, talking about closing out the Q3 numbers, or a call with the Meridian people that ran long. Meridian Capital Partners had come up more and more in his conversation that fall, a private equity group, he said, interested in strategic partnership opportunities with firms like ours. I'd nodded along at dinner, distracted by my own deadlines, trusting him the way you trust someone after 2 decades of trusting them. His executive assistant, Renata Cole, had been with the firm for 3 years by then, sharp, capable, 34 years old, the kind of assistant who made Grant's chaotic calendar look effortless. I liked her. I'd recommended her for a raise myself the year before. I never once thought to look closely at how much of Grant's calendar she'd started managing that fall. It wasn't marked with client names at all, just single letters and numbers that meant nothing to anyone but the two of them. I noticed Grant's phone face down more often. I noticed he'd started taking calls on the back porch instead of in his office. I noticed all of it, the way you notice a hairline crack in a foundation, small enough to explain away, if you want badly enough to explain it away. It was a Thursday in late October, the kind of cool New England evening where the radiators in our old Federal Hill townhouse click and groan as they warm. I'd just finished loading the dishwasher when Grant's phone, left face up on the kitchen island while he showered upstairs, lit up with a soft buzz. I wasn't looking for anything. I want to be clear about that, because I've thought about it 100 times since. I wasn't a suspicious wife scrolling through her husband's messages at midnight. I was standing 3 feet away, drying a wine glass, when the screen simply lit up on its own, the way phones do, and the first line of the message sat there in plain black text for anyone standing in that kitchen to read. She doesn't suspect a thing. We're almost there. The name above it was Renata Cole. I stood very still, the dish towel loose in my hand, and read it twice, 3 times, to make sure I hadn't misread something ordinary into something it wasn't. There was no ordinary reading of that sentence. I picked up the phone. His passcode was our wedding anniversary, which felt in that moment like its own small cruelty. I opened the thread. It went back months, not romantic in the way I braced myself for, not at first. Meeting times, document names I didn't recognize, references to the board package, and Marcus's veto clause. And near the bottom of the visible thread from 3 days earlier, once she signs the Q4 authorization, we're clear. She'll think it's routine. My chest didn't race. It went cold and still, the particular stillness I recognize now as my body preparing me for something before my mind had caught up. I heard the shower running steadily upstairs. I set the phone back down exactly where I'd found it, screen dimming, and I sat down slowly on the kitchen stool, hands folded in my lap, staring at my own reflection in the dark window. I didn't know yet what "we're clear" meant. I only knew, with total certainty, that whatever it meant, I wasn't supposed to have seen it, and that meant it involved me. I didn't confront him that night. I want to explain why, because I know how that sounds. 20 years of reading structures taught me one central lesson. If you attack a compromised wall head-on before you understand what's actually holding it up, you bring down more than you intended, and you lose the chance to see what was really wrong with it. Grant came downstairs in a t-shirt and sweatpants, hair still damp, and kissed the top of my head on his way to the refrigerator, entirely unaware that I now knew something had shifted permanently between us. I let him. I asked about his day. He mentioned casually that the Meridian deal was finally coming together, and I nodded, and inside my chest something clicked into a colder, clearer gear I didn't know I had. I didn't sleep that night. I lay on the edge of our bed, listening to Grant's steady breathing, running through everything I could remember about Meridian Capital Partners, a private equity group, a strategic partnership. Grant had mentioned it to our board in passing at the last quarterly meeting, framed as an early-stage conversation, nothing binding, nothing to worry about. I had believed him completely. At 6 the next morning, before Grant woke, I sat at my home office desk with my laptop and pulled up everything our firm had on file about Meridian. It took less than 20 minutes to find the first real crack in the foundation. Meridian Capital Partners had, according to public filings, quietly acquired majority stakes in 2 other boutique architecture firms in the past 18 months both times, immediately after the founding partner's spouse or co-founder had been eased out through what the filings euphemistically called a voluntary restructuring of ownership. I closed the laptop. I understood, with a clarity that felt almost peaceful, that I wasn't looking at an affair that happened to also involve my company. I was looking at a plan to take my company that happened to also involve an affair. I called Priscilla Vance that same morning, no relation to the firm's name, just a fortunate coincidence from years back that Grant used to joke about. Priscilla had handled our ownership structure since the very beginning, back when it was just me, a rented studio, and Marcus Delane's initial investment. "Vivian," she said, once I'd laid out everything I'd seen the night before, "I need you to come in today. Not tomorrow. Today." Sitting across from her an hour later, in her office overlooking the Providence River, she pulled our original 2005 incorporation documents paper this time, not the digital summary everyone had relied on for years. She read through them slowly, her brow furrowing in a way I'd never seen from her in 15 years of knowing her. "Vivian," she said finally, "did you know that the original share allocation from 2005 lists you as holding 62% of founding equity, not 50? I stared at her. "That can't be right. Grant and I have always operated as equal partners, 50-50, since the day he came on." "On paper," Priscilla said carefully, "you never actually amended this. There's a 2010 internal memo referencing an intent to formally split ownership 50-50 once Grant joined as CFO, but it was never executed as a legal amendment. It sat as a draft. For 15 years, everyone, including, I suspect, Grant himself, has operated under an assumption that was never legally true. You have always held clear voting control of this company, Vivian. You just never had a reason to know it." I sat with that for a long moment, feeling something shift under my feet that I hadn't expected. Not danger this time, but ground. Priscilla wasn't finished. She pulled a second document, the original 2005 investment agreement with Marcus Delane, the one that had sat in a filing cabinet largely unread for 2 decades, because it had never once needed to be invoked. "There's a founder's protective clause here," she said, "put in at Marcus's insistence back when you were a 25-year-old with a folding table and no track record. It grants him a standing veto over any transaction that would transfer majority control of the firm to an outside entity, so long as he remains a shareholder of record. He's never sold his original stake, has he?" "No," I said slowly. "He's held on to it the whole time. Says it reminds him what it felt like to believe in something before it was proven. Then Grant and Renata may have spent months building a deal that Marcus Delane can kill with a single phone call," Priscilla said. "They almost certainly don't know that clause exists. Most people who've come through this firm in the last decade wouldn't. It's buried in a founding document nobody's had reason to reread." For the first time since that phone lit up on my kitchen counter, I felt something other than cold, careful dread. I felt the specific, quiet satisfaction of discovering that the walls I thought were being pulled out from under me had never actually been load-bearing walls at all. Over the following 2 weeks, working quietly with Priscilla and a forensic accountant she trusted, I began to see the full shape of what Grant had built. He'd been meeting with Meridian's acquisition team for nearly 5 months, structuring a deal that would use a series of routine-looking quarterly authorizations, the kind I signed without a second thought every quarter, trusting Grant's summaries completely to gradually shift operational control of the firm's assets into a new holding structure controlled by Meridian. Renata's meticulous calendar, the very organizational skill that made her so effective as an assistant, became the thing that undid the plan. She'd logged every single meeting with precise timestamps and attendee lists, treating the secrecy of the arrangement as just another scheduling detail to manage carefully rather than something to obscure entirely. She had no reason to think she was building a case against the man she believed loved her. She was simply doing her job exceptionally well, and in doing it well, she'd built an airtight, dated record of exactly when the conspiracy began, who attended each meeting, and which draft documents were reviewed when. I don't think Renata ever understood until much later that she wasn't an equal architect of this plan. She was the person managing its logistics while believing she was managing a future with Grant. I'd come to feel something more complicated than anger toward her by the end of it, not forgiveness, not quite, but a clear-eyed understanding that she'd been used by the same man in 2 different ways at the same time. 3 weeks after that night in the kitchen, the trap Grant had built for me finally arrived on my desk exactly as the text message had promised it would. A routine-looking Q4 authorization form, the kind I'd signed a dozen times over the years without reading past the summary page, landed in my inbox with Grant's typical cover note, standard quarterly sign-off. Nothing unusual, just needed by Friday for the board package. I read every single page this time, buried on page 11, in language dense enough to lose almost anyone skimming for the summary, was an authorization granting the CFO's office expanded signing authority over strategic partnership transactions exceeding standard operational thresholds. Language broad enough to cover exactly the kind of transfer Grant and Renata had been quietly building toward for months. I didn't sign it. I didn't ignore it either. I forwarded it to Priscilla with a single line. "This is the document. I need you and Marcus in the same room before Friday, January 2026. The quarterly board meeting fell on a bitter cold Tuesday, the harbor outside our conference room windows the color of dull pewter. Grant walked in exactly the way he always had, relaxed, confident, unaware that anything had shifted beneath him. He'd brought the finalized board package himself, the one containing the Q4 authorization he still believed I'd signed without a second glance, the same way I always had. Marcus Delane was already seated at the far end of the table when Grant walked in, which visibly surprised him. Marcus rarely attended quarterly meetings anymore, preferring to review minutes after the fact. Priscilla sat beside him with a folder I recognized as containing the original 2005 documents. Grant began the meeting the way he always did, walking the board through quarterly performance, his voice smooth and practiced. When he reached the section on strategic opportunities, he mentioned Meridian Capital Partners in the same easy, dismissive tone he'd used with me for months as an early-stage conversation. Nothing binding yet, simply exploring options for future growth capital. "Grant," I said, and something in my voice made him pause mid-sentence. "I'd like to ask you directly. Has a term sheet already been drafted with Meridian for a transfer of majority operational control?" The silence that followed told me everything before he said a single word. His eyes flicked, just once, toward the door, the way people look toward an exit they've already calculated the distance to. "Vivian, it's not what you think. It's a standard growth." "I've read the emails, Grant," I said, keeping my voice level. "I've read the calendar. I know about the meetings with Renata that started in September. I know about the plan to use my quarterly sign-off to authorize expanded transaction control without my full understanding of what I was authorizing." Grant's face went through several rapid transformations, disbelief, then something calculating, then finally a kind of cornered stillness I'd never seen on him before. "You don't understand the full picture," he said, his voice dropping into the same practiced, reasonable tone he used to walk nervous clients through budget overruns. "This deal secures the firm's future for the next 20 years. I was protecting what we built." "You were selling what I built," I said. using my own trust in you as the mechanism to do it. There's a difference, and I think you know exactly what it is." Marcus cleared his throat then, and the entire room's attention shifted to him. "Grant," he said, in the unhurried voice of a man who'd spent decades in boardrooms far more hostile than this one, "I don't believe you're aware of a clause in the original 2005 investment agreement. As long as I remain a shareholder of record, which I do, no transfer of majority control to an outside entity can proceed without my consent. I do not consent. I want that on the record, effective immediately." Grant's mouth opened, then closed. He looked at Priscilla, who slid the original incorporation documents across the table without a word. He read the ownership breakdown in silence, his jaw tightening as he reached the line confirming what he'd apparently never known himself, that he had never held the equal ownership stake he'd spent 15 years assuming and structuring an entire secret deal around. "This isn't possible," he said quietly. "We've operated as 50-50 partners since a memo that was never legally executed," Priscilla said. "You've been building a takeover of a company in which you never actually held the controlling stake you believed you did. Even setting aside Marcus's veto, Vivian could have blocked this deal unilaterally the entire time, simply by virtue of the paperwork that sat in my office since the year this firm was founded. The board voted, within the hour, to terminate Grant's position as CFO for breach of fiduciary duty, citing the documented pattern of meetings and the attempted expansion of signing authority without full board disclosure. Renata resigned the same week, once the forensic accountant's findings made clear the scope of what she'd unknowingly helped facilitate. I didn't pursue anything further against her. She wrote me a letter months later that I still have not an excuse, just an account of how thoroughly she'd believed in a future that had never actually been offered to her honestly by anyone. Meridian Capital Partners quietly withdrew their interest within a month. Once it became clear the deal they'd spent half a year structuring rested on a legal foundation that had never existed, I heard secondhand that they moved on to their next target within the quarter. I don't imagine Grant was invited to be part of whatever came next for them. Grant and I divorced by early spring. It was, by then, less an ending than a formality. The actual ending had happened months earlier. The night a phone lit up on a kitchen counter and told me something my heart had probably already suspected in ways I hadn't let myself examine. Here's what I want you to take from this. I spent 20 years believing a partnership required equal trust in both directions to survive. I was wrong about the mechanics of it, even while I was right about the principle. What actually protected me wasn't blind faith in a 50-50 arrangement. It was the plain, unglamorous truth sitting in a filing cabinet the whole time, put there by people who believed in me before I'd fully proven I was worth believing in. I still run Ashford & Vance today, in the same Federal Hill studio we started in, though we've long since outgrown the folding table. Marcus still stops by every few months, still saying very little, still somehow always right when it matters most. I read every document that crosses my desk in full now, every single page. And I've come to think of that habit not as a scar left by betrayal, but as a discipline I probably should have had all along. If you've ever discovered that the person closest to you was quietly building an exit while you were still building a life together, I hope this told you something worth hearing. Sometimes the ground you're standing on is sturdier than anyone, including you, ever gave it credit for. Has your own foundation ever turned out to be stronger than the person trying to pull it out from under you? Tell me in the comments. I want to hear every one of your stories.